First question everyone asks is, what is the role of a land surveyor? So the quote is, to protect the public and the cadastre in an unbiased professional manner. And you ask, what's the cadastre? The cadastre is both the quantity and the value and the ownership of land. Second thing that I go by as a land surveyor for myself, back about 1984, I got a quote of Chief Seath in his native tongue, born about 1786. He gave an environmental speech in 1854 that's been misquoted, they tell me, 47 times. But the one they think is the closest to the truth is, the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. I've used these two quotes for the last 50 years to explain to my clients that I work for the land. And they're just the temporal owner who gets to pay me to protect the land. Using that, I'm able to work for all of you guys and not get in trouble with neighbors or the city or anyone else. Picture you have here is an early crew from 1913. I gave this talk a couple of years ago, so I thought I would show this picture. I kind of took my hair back to gray, but it was a little different a couple of years ago. This was at the Burnaby Historical Village. I gave two talks on surveying. I should point out, they told me one at 11 and one at 2. So first time I talked for 2.5 hours, and then I couldn't get rid of the people, and they came in for the 2 o'clock one, and the lady said, why are those people still here? You're only supposed to talk for 30 minutes. So I gave the second talk in 30 minutes, and everybody got up and walked home, just walked out the door. They weren't interested at all. So this is a 45-minute talk, so it's somewhere between you didn't learn enough to be interested, or maybe you will. Heard a quote today, people won't remember what I said. People won't remember what I did, but people will always remember how I made them feel. So hopefully I can make you feel good tonight. So we start off in North Vancouver, which is West Vancouver, and this is 1891, so it is before we did our first major survey, but it's showing all of the North Shore. Williams Brothers started in 1888. So we're predecessors of Williams Brothers, became Williams Brothers and Dawson, became Dawson and Elliott, which was my great uncle. And it became a few other names. Now it's Chapman Land Surveying. But it's like George Washington's axe. It's had 47 handles, 8 heads, but that's the same firm. Williams Brothers, Sidney Williams was quite the hunter and quite the marksman. He had the first ascent of Grouse Mountain with some of his friends. They shot some grouse and they decided to name it Grouse Mountain. They shot a goat on the next mountain over and they named it Goat Mountain. They then shot a 15-pound coon and they brought him back to Vancouver, but they didn't name a mountain after him, which was just as good. We have a cover of a book that Sidney Williams did in 1892, and it's just to show the detail of the drafting on the field book, which is getting stored away forever and nobody will ever see again until I dug it out for tonight. I have a display of survey equipment over here, of drafting equipment, to show you that I'm a dinosaur. When I started on that instrument there, built by the Gurley brothers in Troy, New York in 1910. And I think it was model number 984 in 1910. They numbered every instrument they made. I then went on to learn how to draft, and there's guides here where I had to draw numbers and letters for 4 months before I could start doing lines on a plan. And then there's other tools of the trade that are obsolete now. And so with that, it made me obsolete. So my company is now a consulting company. So the first survey, this is Sidney Williams. I said there wasn't a picture of Sidney Williams, but I do have one. That's Sidney Williams there. And this young man is Ernest Cleveland. Ernest Cleveland articled in 1892, became a land surveyor in 1902. Later on, he became the commissioner of the water district, but in between, he laid out Squamish. You've got Cleveland Avenue and Squamish, and you've got the Cleveland Dam. And I have his triangle. It's carved. It's stamped right into it, E. Cleveland. So this is when he worked for us in 1892. Next thing that we did, this is just an early survey of Dawson. Dawson joined the Williams brothers. This is 1907. This is a fish cannery up the coast for H.O. Bell Irving. And Bell Irving fits into the story of Chapman Land Surveying. We laid out a lot of the fish camps with his ABC fishing company that he was part of. This is early surveys among the stumps. You can see the instrument down near the ground. Unfortunately, I had a second photograph with him on top of the stump, but due to the shape of the picture, it got cut off. So this is the man of the hour. This is my great uncle John, who articled and became a land surveyor in 1906. So you've seen the odd T-shirt around. We say family is 1906 to 1922. Now this map is the first map that Dawson and Elliott, down at the bottom right-hand corner, prepared. And on it, can we turn that over? On it, we can see the next part. The Keith Road started here, and it jogged across and up and across and around some of these district lots, crossed over the Seymour River and Lynn Creek, the Capilano River, came down past where the police station was. 1912, West Van changed the name of Keith Road that was close to the water to Marine Drive, and it then ran further out. We can switch to this plan here, which shows Keith Road entering where Spurway is, and then it runs across and still exists all the way down to the police station, then disappears. But when West Van was trading land at the foot of 22nd Street, we found a plan with Keith Road on it. So Keith Road ran along Marine Drive. It then shows up again here as it comes into Caulfield, disappears as it comes through the old lower Caulfield land, and then reappears and comes up to here. It then runs down into Eagle Harbor. And that's where the initial road was built. North Van was created in 1891. Williams Brothers and Dawson were then hired to lay out this road. Had to be a good wagon road, had to have good views and best crossings of the creeks. We still have bridges on all three of those creeks. And it only went to Eagle Harbor at that time at a cost of $47,000. 3 years later, they extended it from Eagle Harbor up to Horseshoe Bay at a cost of $70,000 as they were opening up the White Cliff City. But the provincial government paid $50,000 of that $70,000. Not something we hear much of these days. It was during this time that the firm first met Edward Mahan. You've heard of Mahan Park in North Van, and you think that's where he did everything. But he bought land from Navijack In 1893, he bought the westerly 100 acres of Navijack's land. And just finishing off with Navijack, he actually, Navijack lost the property. Keith Road named after. Keith bought the property. John Lawson then bought the property from Keith. And then Lawson was foreclosed on in 1916, and John Mahan bought it. So again, we've got Mahan deep into West Van. He also built the land known as Altamont. So all the big lots in Altamont were Mahan. Now Mahan, his uncle, very successful businessman in England, died at an early age, left him in 1880 a mere 230,000 pounds. So he traveled around the world for the first year trying to figure out what to do with some of it, liked Vancouver, and decided to invest in BC. He bought some land. He bought some land in the West Kootenays, and he built himself a little town called Castlegar. Castlegar was named after their ancestral home in County Galloway. And it actually didn't really get going till the CPR bridge came across in 1902. Then a hotel and a schoolhouse got built in 1908. Currently has a population of 8,000. So I jumped back and forth. People have been bugging me for years to put a book together. And so you've seen on the title picture that we've written a book. I paid an author to write the book. You don't want me to write books. Rain in Rugged Terrain. And you can sign up if you want us to notify you when it's published. Should happen later this year. Unfortunately, my author died on me 3 months ago. And COVID hit us hard. And so the book ends about 1940. So we're trying to tell you the whole story, but it stops about 1940. I mentioned it. We also met Bell Irving. You saw him on the waterfront. And I believe it's one of his sons, Peter Bell Irving, articled to the firm, became BC Land Surveyor number 117. He was working on a fish camp survey up the coast when the First World War was declared. He immediately dropped the job. One of the partners had to go finish it. He went to war, and he has the poor distinction, unfortunate distinction, of being the first BC land surveyor to die in the First World War. Again, we're back to Bell Irving family. Same time, they also met the Haywood Lonsdale people that owned a lot of estate land in North Vancouver. And they built a small subdivision for them of 1,400 lots as you first head up Keith off of Marine Drive, going past St. Thomas Aquinas School. St. Thomas Aquinas School was owned by the Sisters of the Order of the Child Jesus. And they called Sandy and I for a survey and want us to subdivide it. The church was going to buy some more to expand St. Thomas Aquinas. And I said, well, you called the right firm because we did the survey before. She said, oh, no, we're a very old order, and we bought this land in 1894. I said, yes, I pulled out the plan before I called you. We jump back to Mahan. He then formed a prospecting syndicate of British Columbia, which he capitalized with 70,000 pounds. He also went into the timber business. And so then in 1908, we went up the coast. This is Alert Bay, and my uncle took a couple of pictures of the village on the way across to some copper claims. And so copper claims are mining operation at Kaida Bay, southeast corner of Haida Gwaii. And the gentleman who built that originally started in fishing, but the Japanese were persecuted so badly back in the day that he switched to copper, and he said it can't be that hard. You just find a piece of rock that looks a little burnished like the guy next door. And he found and staked 8 claims at Acadia Bay. And we then went up and surveyed it. They didn't build houses. They took this big schooner, Dawson, not named after my partner, and they all lived on it. They had a doctor, they had nurses, and it was a town. They had over 100 miners. They had the tram, which I showed you. Working conditions were not bad, but it looks tough here. And they invited the provincial government. 3 members of the government came over. And in 1907, he was offered $1.5 million for his copper claim. Having got away from the white guys and running a good operation, he told them to we then move on to a survey in West Van, where we created a number of lots again early in 1909. And we hit the boom years of surveying, the golden age of surveying British Columbia, 1909 to 1913. This you all recognize as Horseshoe Bay. It was called White Cliff City back in the day. 575 lots. And when they opened, they employed 28 people for the grand opening day to sell the lots. And many of those lots still exist today. So this is where I'm trying to show they created so many lots. The average land surveyor was creating between 10 and 20 lots a day. And a land surveyor got paid $5 a lot, and employees got paid on top of that. Employees weren't considered part of the bill. The land surveyor was a fee, and then all the others were expenses. So the people working there were getting paid $2 a day. Land surveyors getting $5 a lot. Average man's making $400 a year, and these fellas are making a lot of money. My uncle was listed in the BC Who's Who as one of the 10 most eligible bachelors in British Columbia. Nobody would think that of a land surveyor today. Like, not going to let your daughters near us. This is just showing how they started advertising the subdivisions that I showed you. Back here, they made a new map every year. Upper right, Mahan again, McFarland and Proctor. Every year they made one to help sell their land. And so the world was different back then. This is some of the equipment we use this is a planimeter for measuring area on a plan. Purchased in 1910. My uncle went to the Seattle World's Fair. And you guys all say, well, the Seattle World's Fair was 62. But we're in a library, so I brought the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, 1909, June 1st to October 16th, 1909. One of the people who came were the Gurley brothers that made the instrument over here, an instrument that I used personally when I started working with my dad. And Uncle John met the Gurleys, and one of the problems he had with it is he didn't think the standards that hold up the transit were that strong. But Gurleys pointed out that if you damaged them, you could heat them over a campfire and straighten them out at night. And you could get in at the lens and replace your crosshair with a spider's web if you needed to. And so all of our equipment during that period are girlies, and we've got about 6 or 8 of these. Old mining claims, again, just showing that we work hard for our citizens, but you guys don't keep us busy enough, so we have to run off when there's slowdowns in the economy, do mining claims, do forestry, do a lot of other things to survive. There's a field book for mining claim up on the Seymour Creek. Again, it's 1907, signed by John Elliott, my great uncle. So this one here is the next partner, that John Mervyn Hewitt. He was 45 years old when he decided to article to become a land surveyor, and there's history of him back there if you have time to look at it. And people are willing to, that want to, can stand up and look at the display while I'm talking. I don't mind. We have displays there and over here, so feel free. He enlisted in the First World War. He just enlisted as a private. I don't believe you could enlist if you're over 40 years old. At the time he was 54, but you can see he's over 6'4" in height. He picked the young man up so they were eyeball to eyeball and said, "Son, do I not look 40 to you?" He fought at Vimy Ridge. In fact, during the war, 3 of the Elliots went to war. One was injured badly with mustard gas and never had a full-time job after that. He was probably the smartest of the bunch. He wasn't a land surveyor. He was going to be a lawyer. He heard they were going to make more money in the future, so I should get in there now. John Elliott stayed home because he was the oldest brother and had to run the firm. And we still have to keep the home front going, and so the government expects people in industries like this to stay home. But the world slowed down. The boom years ended in 1913, so most of the surveyors were happy to go to war. But they were also gun fodder for snipers, because their job was to go out at night and lay out the trenches. And so they're having to look up over the trenches to lay them out for the next day's battle. And if there's snipers out there, it's a dangerous job. This is, again, work and play. My Uncle John is here. Mervyn Hewitt is here. Early baseball team. This is just a diary of Hewitt's working with Hector Elliott before Hector became a land surveyor. And they're up close to the Alberta border west of Edmonton. Here's Edward Mahan that we've talked about, just to show you. He was a very affluent businessman. I think I've kind of explained everything that he did, except for the next one that we come to now. He also had the timber claims. So on the Skeena River, he had 80 timber claims, a mile square. And we sent a little crew up. You can see 13 of them here to do the surveys on the Skeena River. Now, they bought the canoes, the dugouts, from the natives, and my great-uncle told me if at the end of the season, the natives who worked with them, if they did a good job, he gave them the canoes at the end of the season. He bought them at the beginning and gave them to them at the end. If they didn't do a good job, he hung them up in the trees.
Oh, the canoes.
In the thought that the canoes, in the hope that he might come back next year. And so for a while, Chapman Land Surveying had the most canoes in the province, tied up in trees in various areas. But you can see they're pretty big canoes. You can see the Skeena River is pretty big. So I also like to jump back and forth and explain that in 1965, I surveyed on the south bank of the Skeena River, and we got stuck one night and a boat was supposed to come pick us up. We had been driving in from the other side, from the Kitimat end before, and we were now further west heading towards Rupert. The boat was supposed to pick us up, didn't show up, so 2 of us swam the Skeena River in 1965, and not many people can say they're dumb enough to do that. And that's camp up there. We then did some special surveys. This is where I say that West Van's really lucky. They got developed in kind of 1910, 1909, the first surveys. We had this kind of equipment because we were surveying with these in 1906. And so all the surveys in West Van are pretty good, except for 1 or 2 ne'er-do-well surveyors that didn't do a very good job. But in North Vancouver, we had to use that special survey monument you see on the left, because they had discrepancies of 126 feet and numbers like that, which kind of bother you if you own a 50-foot lot. We also worked up near Alta Lake. And so this, as you can see, is a settler's home up there. And this is the Daisy Lake Post Office. Now, my brother and I, my brother's here, my sister's also here, my wife's here, my daughter's here, 2 grandsons are here. All of them have worked for Chapman's. A couple of them still do. We stayed very close to this at a little old hotel they had on Daisy Lake at the south end when we surveyed Powder Mountain in 1968. There's Port Progress. Again, just my Uncle John here. We had a second picture with some goats in the camp and the cook. And someone said we really shouldn't show what the cook was bringing for dinner. My uncle also got involved in town planning, and he was on the first planning commission for Point Grey before Point Grey was part of Vancouver. And so he's listed on the commission there in the middle, appointed members. He served on it for 30 years, and he was given a Freedom of Vancouver Award from the City of Vancouver years later. Depression hit, and they had to find work, so they went up to Fort St. John. The government had some work in the Peace River block, and John realized that horse and buggy weren't as good as a car, but to get here he had to drive down through Spokane and up through Alberta and come back around the back door. So this is surveying up there, squatter's cabin again. Their first task, he was sent up with 3 other surveyors from the province. He was in charge because he had now been a land surveyor for 25 years. So he was the senior surveyor. The first thing they did was make all the squatters' cabins onto lots and make them legal. And so they did have to bring supplies in as they got further away from the roads. And at times, Uncle John had to go in on horseback. We hired the First Nation, and you'll see a picture in a minute here. Out of order, so I'll flip back. Patrick Madam is a First Nations boy that was a cook for them, and they thought he was excellent. And he worked for a couple of months, and then he disappeared. And they were up there for 5 months. And they didn't know what happened to the cook. They came back up next season. Patrick Madam's first in line to sign up again. He said, Uncle John said, why do I want to hire you? Like, you worked for 2 months and then you left. No, boss, he said, I worked for 2 months and then you pay me. Job over, I went home. So he worked for 5 months, they paid him, he went home, and for several years after that, they had great seasons. So we've always had a good position with the First Nation on all our jobs. We've worked with them. Currently, we've done all the homes under the First Narrows Bridge. My dad then, I'm jumping time-wise, not that bad. We jump up a few years, so maybe I can digress for a minute, back up to these two. This is Fort St. James. Now it's interesting. How many of you came to the talk last month? So you know they were talking about Sir James Douglas. And Sir James Douglas, his wife's name was Sophia. My great-grandmother's name was Sophia. He was born in British Guyana. My wife Sandy was born in British Guyana. And the first post he had was Fort St. James. And oh, whoops, here we are back to this. We're in Fort St. James. Doesn't end there because my father, war came and he found that a friend called who was a small S surveyor in Vancouver. His father was a land surveyor. And he said the Air Force wants surveyors to lay out airstrips in BC to protect us from an attack from the west. And so Dad got a job. His commission during the war as a sergeant was laying out airstrips on the Pacific Northwest staging route. And he was in Fort St. James. You can see the note up in the corner himself with the arrow pointed at it. It doesn't look like they're laying out airstrips here, but, and they're not all surveyors, but this is a typical Friday night in a survey office up until probably 1970. Friday nights were notorious in survey offices. A lady in Victoria asked in 1908 why the surveyors that came to town were so rowdy. And one of the young men said, "Perhaps, madam, it's a 12-foot salal that we have to cut through on the west coast of Vancouver Island." And so we've always claimed that we've had to have a nip now and again to take care of that. So here's Cape St. James Barracks. And my dad had to lay these buildings out. Now, I can't tell you, it could be the building right near the water. He was laying out a building, and he laid it out quickly and realized that it was 20 feet into the water. Went to his commanding officer, and he said, "What do I do?" Commanding officer said, "Son, you follow your orders." So it took him 2 days to do his calculations for the building. But when he laid the building out, he was dyslexic. He was supposed to turn an angle of 37 degrees. He turned an angle of 73 degrees, and the building sits on the land. But it was a dyslexic error. Anyone can make a dyslexic error, so you cannot get court-martialed for a dyslexic error. My dad didn't like conflict. He had 8 privates under him, and they used to have to march every Saturday on the grounds with their guns, and one of them accidentally had his safety off, and he fired 8 shots around his foot. My dad then marched them out for survey, had them cut wooden rifles in the woods, and for the next 3 years they marched with wooden rifles. At the end of the war, when he handed in his kit bag, they found this gun in the bottom, and they put their hand in the barrel of the gun and said, "What's that?" He looked at it, he said, "I suspect when the manufacturer made the gun, he put some grease in it." Regulations said you had to fire it once a week, but he had never seen it before. So this is after the war. The only picture I have of my father with his shirt off. He was a very private man, but I thought it was kind of a cool picture of him. I apologize, I don't have the note of where it is. Looks like it could be here, but it's not, so I can't claim I'm in British properties yet. We also jump in the book back to the history of my great-grandfather, who was a telegrapher in the U.S. Army. He actually wrote a book on practical telegraphy, which I have here tonight because I'm in a library, so I brought some books. We always thought he was a Southerner, but when the man researched this book, we found out in actual fact he was a Northerner, and the Southerners were coming up during the Civil War to blow up one of the Northern battleships. And so they kidnapped him out of his telegraph office and took him with them. They were unsuccessful blowing up the ship, but when they came back, they dropped him off the equivalent of Hope, 100 miles away, to walk home so that they could get back safely. He then joined the U.S. Army, and he laid out telegraph lines on the East Coast and on the West Coast. Two of his sons came to Vancouver. Unfortunately, long story, you got to buy the book. My great-grandfather committed suicide, and his widow and two daughters came to Vancouver. My grandfather married the older daughter. My great-uncle John married the younger daughter. And the one son married a gal whose brother worked for the Williams brothers. So you got to go through the whole book to figure it out, but it's there. Interesting for me because I got to learn something about my family. This is the telescope that he used, and this is the book that he used to make his notes. And this book actually worked like a blueprint book in that he wrote on the first flimsy and he got a copy on the second page. And so the book is here. Unfortunately, my father didn't care much about history, and when we were small and wanted to draw, he tore all the pages out that had writing on them and gave us the book to draw in. But this is the book that Swift used. So we now jump forward. I guess I was talking about the Skeena River and the timber leases. Again, Mahan capitalized that with $250,000. And so the amounts of money that the developers and surveyors were using back in those days were something. Another special survey we did was in Port Moody. I had those plans, but I was told I had too much stuff here. We did the special survey in 1912. Port Moody was incorporated in 1913, but there was an argument between Port Moody and Coquitlam and the provincial government. Hewitt went off to the First World War. Hewitt died in 1930, and they did not register his plan until 1949. And so, again, thank God you live in West Van where the plans work well. We talked of the fish camps, and we talked of the Belle Irvings. And one of the fish camps was the Good Hope Cannery. That was one of the Belle Irvings. And one of my good clients in West Van has bought the Good Hope Cannery. And so, if you live long enough, it comes back to haunt you. So I jumped to 1968. We're up in the Powder Mountain surveying. We did use helicopters some days. This is the only grizzly bear I've had on a survey crew. Lots of black bears. We've had black bears come right up within 10 feet of us, but this fellow with the hump on his back, you don't want him within 10 feet of you. And you wouldn't want him that day within 10 feet of you because I think he was a little upset. Although our helicopter pilot was very good, he was only close to him for maybe 40 seconds and he moved out of the way. Unlike a boy when I was in Terrace in '65 who liked to chase the animals. And a bear came back one night on the Sunday and he saw the helicopter and he pushed, came around, something hit him on his back and he pushed it again a little harder, came around, hit him on the back again. So then he took his hand and just knocked the propeller right off the helicopter. And then his hand was hurting, so then he knocked the bubble off. I'm told it cost $100,000 to fix a helicopter. And we didn't have to worry about the pilot because they fired him the next day. Oh, back to that guy that gave a talk a couple of months ago. So now we can jump to the British properties. This is the British properties in 1955. Sorry, I'm going to switch once more here, and we'll look at the plan on the other side here. But you can see it was cut out in 1955. It wasn't always like that, but they realized that the citizens wanted smaller lots and better views. And so it got cut out for this picture in 1955. The map over on the side, if you have time, because I'm told I'm going to quit in 15 minutes here. This is a map that we prepared in 1996 when the company was celebrating 50 years for my father, 70 years for my great uncle, and 110 for the company. This plan here shows how West Van was developed by the decades. So here's our survey in 1891, and this one in 1891 was first survey in West Van. The first survey that I did in West Van is 1960, which my brother's handing out here, and it's for the old tramway that ran through here. And today, British Properties has 2 of those trams up in Cypress Village if you go up there to walk their Christmas trails and have a pizza at the shed. And so again, we're jumping through 3 generations. So then we have the surveys that were done in just 1908 and 1909. This whole Ambleside area of West Van, the major blocks were staked out in 2 years. Then between 1910 and 1919, we filled in a few more in here. Everything on here are just lots created by our firm, not by other people. So the colored ones are created by our firm. We then go to 1920 to 1929, where we have Altamont here. And then we show 1930 to 1939, and we have 2 lots here, 2 lots here, and we come into the British properties. So go ahead, you can put the other one up. So we come across and we show how we get through up to 1996. The backside of this one, if we have time, we'll show you what we've done since 96. So as well as Powder Mountain, which we showed you, we also did Cypress Bowl. And so Cypress Bowl was 1969. How many of you remember Cypress Bowl in 69? Yeah, we've got one fellow here that surveyed for Department of Highways, and he'll point out some areas on the highway are extra wide, and we couldn't figure out why, but that's where the yellow cedar was, and the foresters were getting, the loggers were getting extra money for yellow cedar, so if they saw a patch, they would just move his cut lines to include the yellow cedar, and they'd cut it out. I worked in Cypress Bowl in '69. We had a crew of 15 people, and the government came in and tore up the leases from a company that had bought it from the West Van boys, a company called Bengay out of New York with money out of the Bahamas. And I don't think anyone in this room knows, because we're pretty quiet with what our clients want. Clients wanted us to lay out 2,000 cabins in the summer of 1970. And so we were drawing plans for 8 different survey companies to come in and lay out for 250 cabins each when the leases got torn up. I'd also bought skis and got them delivered the day before the leases got torn up. So I never got to use the skis on Cypress Bowl until years later. The chairman of British Properties also worked in Cypress Bowl the same year. He was running a dump truck and one of the loaders. But they took the logs out on aero transfer vehicles, didn't have air brakes, and they couldn't hold the logs. And so as we were going up to survey, we had to get the hell out of the way if a truck's coming down because it couldn't stop. We swung over on the one corner, and I was a passenger. I looked out the side. I couldn't see anything for 45 feet. So I told the driver to lock up the car, would climb out and have a look. And the front wheel and the rear wheel were fine, but in between, we could see down for 50 feet straight down. So we let the driver back in because he caused the problems. We made him put his glasses back on because he wasn't wearing them. And then we had him back up slowly so that he could then turn out and miss the little notch.
Obviously wasn't bad.
So now we've get to this in a minute. 1972 was the BC Rail derailment. And Fred and I used to row for Canada, and our rowing coach was in the home where the train, 2 cars came down that derailed. 6:30 a.m., 19th of February, 1972. And his wife heard the first shunt of the cars, thought the baby was crying, ran for the baby, realized the baby was okay, went to the bathroom, heard the cars coming down the hill, ran back for the baby, and the bathroom was gone. Baby grew up, went to Hansford, same school as my daughter, and actually dated my daughter Chelsea at the back of the room. We then worked for him. He ran a ski team on Grouse Mountain. We laid out some surveys on Grouse Mountain that we had named in 1894, and we laid out a couple of homes for him and take it that way. But in the old days, we had to shoot the sun and get a bearing. And so we laid out the golf course first in 1936. Then we laid out 450 lots in what you see as individual lots here. But they were 1 to 3 acres each. They were too big. So then we cut them up. So I wanted to figure out just how we did that and how long it took. Well, it took me 12 hours and my wife 8 hours and my daughter 5 hours to figure it out. And between 1938, because we actually re-subdivided 2 parcels in 38, between 1938 and really 1956, we went into the individual blocks and we had to cut a road through and then create another set of lots and another set of lots and another set of lots. So in some cases, we would take a block from 7 lots to 20 lots, from 16 lots to 39 lots. And a number of the lots, between 1941 and 1946, the approving officer was Ed Richardson, who later worked for the British Properties and then sold his practice to us in 1969. So Ed had come from Barkerville to work for West Van, and so he was the approving officer. We also have one plan that Ed did where he did the survey and he signed it, Ed Richardson, BC Land Surveyor. He then came into the municipal office, hung up his coat and his hat, walked over to the other side of the desk, sat down, looked at it, and signed it as the approving officer. Ed Richardson, professional engineer. Questioned him, he said, well, they're 2 different professions, 2 different jobs, both professionals that are sworn to uphold certain duties, and the fact that the same signature doesn't matter. He lived to 107. He just died a couple of years ago. British Properties can tell you that he got a pension till the day he died. He was making more. He was making more on his pension than he made in his working life. Anyhow, but between 1938 and 1956, my great-uncle John Elliott, his brother Hector Elliott, and my dad Ray Chapman surveyed and created 1,100 lots. So we took the original 450 lots and we turned them to 1,100 lots. And yet we tell everyone today this is the original British properties. So again, we're back to George Washington's acts. So I have that history, and I've got a plan for Reto, who's the archivist, who took 50 boxes of files from my office to keep some of this history and a bunch of the plans. Reto's at the back of the room. I can't thank him enough for saving some of the history for me and for the citizens of West Vancouver, although he has me coming in working half a day a week to go through them to set them up. Sorry, I forgot. I have the big plan on there for you too, showing the different years as we put it together. But all that remains from the original subdivision is that one parcel there and 2 parcels here and the original small lots that are down just off the highway. Everything else got subdivided. So when you say it's the original British properties, it's changed a little bit. So I'm getting near the end. My wife Sandy thought that West Van should be doing something for the Olympics in 2010. We pitched it to West Van, weren't interested. We pitched it to Park Royal, who weren't interested. We pitched it to Cypress Bowl, who weren't interested. So you might notice that the little boy's name on his pants, on his hat, on his belt say Chapman. So we put them up and we did the Olympic countdown for 2010. Couldn't get permission to put them up, but it was legal for him to put up for the election beforehand. So they were up 420 days before the election. And people would knock on the door and ask, why does this number keep changing? And Sandy had to explain to them we were actually counting down to the Olympics. The gal who won the gold medal in the skiing up at Whistler stopped with her dad to thank us for the countdown because it inspired them to work harder. And so these 3 guys helped her win a gold medal. So that was kind of cool. And we don't advertise, but I can't walk into a room like this without someone walking up and saying, are you the guy who had the sign? And I say, yeah, but it was actually my wife's idea and my son who designed them. So there's the immediate family with my dad, my brother to the left, and my sister to the right. And this is Rain and Rugged Terrain. I'll finish off with this shirt or logo. My son designed the logo in 1996 for the party that I told you we had. We invited 500 people, only 450 came. We threw a party that with far bigger displays than this, a room 3 times, well, bigger than this. We had 450 people. People say, how good was the display? I said, 2 lawyers looked at the display for 2 hours before they availed themselves of a free drink. It then went on to the library, and the library had it for a display for 8 months after that. Anyhow, we had the logo, and my granddaughter called Sandy to see if we would donate money for shirts for her soccer team to go on an international trip. So Sandy kicked in the most money of anybody, and so we got to put the logo on. So we sent the 96 logo to my son, granddaughter's father. My daughter Chelsea and I went over to tell him that I was selling the operating portion of my company, and I see on the computer this little bear walking over to a transit, and I go like, holy cow, you're designing a new logo. And he said, well, you can't put a 1996 logo on a 14-year-old girl's soccer shirt. You got to have a new one. So that's why it says 1906 on the left when my uncle joined the company, 2022 when we shut down the operating company. So now we're just a consulting company. I think they want me to stop, but I'm available for questions. And I think Laura's going to moderate the questions. Thank you very much. Oh, Pauline Johnson School. You know, Inglewood goes across by Pauline Johnson School. And the original surveys for West Van were all north, south, east, west. And the only flat land for the school had the school on one side of Inglewood and the playground on the other side. And he said, well, what the hell? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And when he came down, was the town next to Barkerville that he laid out? Wells, BC. He laid out the town of Wells, BC. And so that's another story. He had no work as an engineer in 1932. So he hopped a train up to Barkerville, hearing they were opening up, and he might get some work up there as an engineer. So on the stagecoach in, and well-dressed gentleman said, young man, where are you going? Well, I hear might be work there. I'm an engineer. I don't have any work. I thought there could be work at the mine. Well, son, he said, I own the mine. I don't have any work. But he said, the stagecoach is going that way. It doesn't come back till tomorrow, so welcome to Barkerville and town we're trying to build. And so almost there, he said, do you chop wood? Like, I need some wood for the winter, and you're here. So Ed chopping firewood, and the surveyor, Colonel Gook, his name was, walked into his office and said, you know, I can lay out this new town of Wells, BC, but I can't do the servicing. I'm not an engineer. You need an engineer. Well, he said, you know, I got a young guy who claims to be an engineer cutting firewood for me. So he stayed there. He built a home. He lived there. Colonel Gook taught him to be a land surveyor because there wasn't a lot to do. So he's now an engineer and a land surveyor. Ran out of work. There was an ad for a municipal engineer. He didn't know what the hell it was. And it was in West Vancouver. And he called. And a call came in to him. He applied. Call came to him. Only one phone in Wells. He had to run for the phone. And the operator said it was a fellow named Mr. Richardson wanting to talk to him. He thought his dad was pulling a prank on him, but no, it was Councillor Richardson wanting to hire him in West Van. So he hired the first men using machinery in West Vancouver. Everybody was still digging ditches from the Depression. So then we get to the answer to the question, and the school and the road coming through the middle. He said that made no sense, so there were a couple of machines around. Next morning he hopped on one, laid out Inglewood so that it missed the school, and they put a plan in some years later, but didn't worry about the plan. They just wanted the school to be in the right place. No, we talked about the plan that he approved both ways.
Okay.
He also laid out the third lane on the Lionsgate Bridge. British Properties hired him to be their engineer. He laid out the third lane on the Lionsgate Bridge. He still had my uncles doing the surveys in the old British Properties. But then he laid out Chartwell, all the streets that are named in memory of Sir Winston Churchill were laid out by Ed. And then Ed took over Cypress Park Estates for the Greenwood family, all the streets that have the word green in it, or wood. And so he had Park Royal Shopping Center, British Properties, and the Greenwood Estate, which he sold to us in '69. Cam, we've got two land surveyors here from Hobbs Winter McDonald that I've sold to. It'd be interesting to know that he actually charged us more in day dollars to buy the firm from him in '69 than it cost them to buy mine. But it worked out well for us. We've worked for British Properties continually, and couldn't have a better client. British Properties pays fast, pays politely. I was their surveyor for, I don't know, Jeff might say 35 years. So pretty exciting time for me.